This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's been an interesting day. 10 o'clock this morning, I went to the city recycling event. I had 2 or 3 what do you call them? Television, old style television sets that can't recycle any other way because they're usually high in heavy metals, and they have some poisons in them that the feds don't want them going into regular recycling. So you can't recycle those old units at a regular recycling center. So there's a certain day and you can recycle all sorts of electronics. It has been run periodically. It probably costs a fair bit. It's subsidized usually by the federal government, but that subsidization has waned, I think. Some local communities are accepting electronic salvage, but they're charging for it like $10 a set. So this is not a charge situation. And instead of lining everyone up between the hours of 8 and 12 or whatever, it was spread over 2 days, Friday and Saturday. And you could choose a time to go and register. And so it was very efficient. We arrived almost without a stop. Everyone was lined up. We didn't have to get out of the vehicle. The vehicle was unloaded by healthy people. And I don't know where this goes. It may go to New York or somewhere where these pieces of equipment are salvaged properly. It used to be that there was enough heavy metals like gold and platinum and other items that you would have people on the side taking computers and the like apart, and that was a small industry. And now it's got to be that so little of those resources are used that they're not as dangerous and they're not as easy to salvage. So you need a special day. You could also store them. We have this thing that we like to do technological improvement, but we don't think too much about what's left over when you do that improvement. When everyone goes to a cell phone, then regular phones are irregular anymore. And so we're left with items that could be stored until there's a day to salvage them, or they could be salvaged on a day, or worse, and we involve it because we have roadside prairies and the like, they get dumped along the roadside, and that's not a very friendly thing to do. So I was pleased with that, and I also got to move some non-electronic items like fans in another direction. So I'm interested in simplifying our shop and documenting. It's a challenge. I've been on the computer this week trying to work with items that are almost beyond my capability, but one has to be bold and sometimes take on the responsibilities. We're community non-profit, so we don't have the luxury of uh, employees who can do this sort of work and other work too. So it's uh, you have to get bold and try to do what you can do. Uh, Today, I've been watching Campus Town, and I've been watching huge buildings go up, and the scene has changed even in a few months, but certainly over years. And I'm thinking that I've been around long enough that I could remind people of what it did look like a few years ago. So I think it's almost the responsibility of older people to bring together some of that information, to remind them what Camperstown looked like a few years ago. Uh, Let me say I came to the US from Australia. I came from a hot summer to a cold winter, and I was extremely impressed that the the buildings heated indoors were very different from what I was used to. Uh, at least where I came from, there was very little air conditioning, very little heating year round. So you got used to colder temperatures. You got used to lots of circulation of air. You had ventilation. You had windows that opened, and it was somewhat more natural. And it took me quite a while to get used to that. But I came to work with Hadley Reid, who was in charge of agriculture communications, and I was trying to bring together science, art, and education, which was a little challenging because most people that came as grad students were going to be specialists. There were some generalists too, but you always had to know that you could never be equal to these specialists in any one field. So that was a challenge. Uh, I worked with people in Hadley's department and with agronomy, and enjoyed doing that. I get to realize that a lot of these colleges, like the University of Illinois, were land grant colleges to encourage extension, which was a word that covered agricultural extension, engineering extension, home economics extension, allowing people that were coming from Europe in the 1860s, 70s to settle in and often take on land and careers that were quite different from what they experienced in Europe. Uh, Sometimes they were actually came with some skills, like drainage skills were needed in Champaign County, and the Deutschlanders and the Frieslanders came with that sort of skill. But mostly there was a need for how do we do this? If you were draining, for instance, you needed to know how to dig a ditch and how to herringbone it and make it flow properly. How do you get water off the landscape fairly quickly? You could dig drains with a digger, but eventually you needed the water to go into flow lines that didn't erode, and often that was there were ceramic pipes that were put down, and they would increase in size as you got nearer to the bottom end of a network of pipes that were under your field. Uh, I was also very interested in the natural history, and I didn't know much about prairie, but I intended to find out. I was kind of surprised that it was almost non-existent because the prairie soils are so rich, and every inch is in agriculture. Firstly, is livestock, but then as mainly row crops, and as particularly corn and soybean, and there would be some oats and barley and uh, the grains that would feed horses, but uh, very little prairie. There's only along railroad lines where there was the adjacent farmer was not supposed to uh, invade, and mostly didn't. So I got involved in that some. But going back to where I came to Gamma Alpha fraternity. It was a graduate fraternity that had engineers and agriculturalists, biologists, and I fitted in there because I had an agriculture degree and was looking for uh, some extension type details that would bring more information from theoretical universities to applied colleges where I was teaching. Uh, this was going to be a short stay, and I was going to go back to Australia and do some reforming or improved teaching on my own. And I got tied up here with uh, prairie preservation and been here for a long time. Uh, so I a couple of years of work in the Gamma Alpha fraternity, which I really enjoyed because half of the participants were from other countries and half of them were locals. And so we bounced off of each other and enjoyed that. Uh, uh, After a while, uh, I changed to an apartment which was on Wright Street above the boneyard. And I was above a dry cleaners named Garber's Dry Cleaners. And I think I would like to walk you around the campus town. It was right on the corner of near to the corner of Green and Wright. So right on campus town. And the occasion arose that an apartment was available in a nearby building. Now, I have to tell you about this building. It's a big old fraternity. It was 624 for the number on the north side of the street, and it was one. It was fairly close to Follett's, which was on the corner of Wright and Green on the northwest corner. The engineering school was on the northeast corner, and Altgeld Hall and the Union was on the other. At this time, the second wing of the Union, the south wing, was still being built. But I found an apartment in what was labeled the Southern Tea Rooms. This was an apartment building that was bought by the Dallenbach family in the Depression between 30 and 40, and many of the fraternities and sororities were finding it hard to survive. So this one that was right on campus was 3 stories high, higher than the Follett's building, and it was bought, and it belonged to the Dallenbach family. There was a fairly prominent family in Champaign, still is. Uh, the Mrs. Dallenbach was born to Daisy Baines and in Lebanon, Tennessee, and her sister was Mrs. Wright, and they came to Champaign because of the family connection, and Mrs. Smith, that's her name. Mrs. Smith was interested in putting in a restaurant. She had a restaurant elsewhere, but this was an open space. It had a setback, so there was a lawn in front with privet hedge and some privacy, but a walkway up to a veranda, an extensive veranda with a swing seat, and people would enjoy to sit on that seat and watch the crowd go by and look across kitty corner at the alcohol hall and listen to the chimes and listen to uh, Carillion's presentations on at lunch hour, that sort of thing. So you had a feeling for being very near and onto campus. Uh, for quite some number of years, Mrs. Smith is in charge of the southern tea rooms, and uh, the foyer inside was large and had a Tiffany era atmosphere. It had a grand piano and violinists and other musicians that came in, and uh, attributes like a canary in a cage or a family cat or whatever. And uh, for quite some time, the southern two rooms, which had a second floor that was uh, used as dormitories and a third floor that was basically a ballroom. And so I took an apartment there, and that was gave me access to the streetscape and the area around. And uh, so let me walk you down the corridor of Green Street. If you're on the north side, there was uh, Follett's. On the ground floor, there was a bookstore, and the upstairs was rented out, often to university staff. And then there was this Southern Tea Rooms, back a little bit, very tall and dignified. Then there was a co-op theater, later to be two co-op theaters. And those theaters were interesting because they were cooled by water coming from an aquifer underneath. What you did was you had an exchange tower and cold water coming up from underneath the ground would cool the air that was being recycled through the theater. So this was a theater that was innovative and at the time uh, giving a coolness that was not available in many theaters. You're thinking of a time when there were a lot of theaters. That was your outlet. You didn't have television. You didn't have much radio either. Radio was still there, but so if you were looking for entertainment, you were looking uh, for theaters, movie theaters, and uh, so we're going down the street, and there was Urber's, a photographic store. In those days, there were two photographic stores. One was Fairchild's, one was Urber's, and photography was a big deal. The university photographer uh, did a lot of photographic work, and one of these stores was a spin-off from that university photography. Uh, and so a little bit further along was Murphy's Pub, which is still there, and characteristic of that corridor. Uh, on the corner was I forget what, but it changed to Busey Bank after a while. So, and across the road, across 6th Street, was Larry Junkin, and he had a stand and gas station right on that corner. And I enjoyed Larry. Uh, we didn't have a lot of money and had old cars, and they had to be maintained in an economic manner. And Larry was very good, and he has a staff that was very good too. So and you waddled along that corridor, and you had old type stores and old type apartments, and uh, let's go back to the south side. The south side was looked like a bank, and it had been a bank, and it was lost out in the depression in the 30s. So it was a restaurant, but it really had the character of a bank. And uh, then you had some bars and restaurants and a flower shop, which had character too. And right on the end was McBride's drugstore. And believe me, now, right there, there's a huge building going up, way up in the sky. And there'll be a drugstore in there, I'm sure. But uh, it's very, very different. That's what makes me think that I can contribute something to you of the past. There was a dress clothing store across the road, and there was a little adjunct store up on Sixth Street, uh, Shram's, I think it was, and just had a quirk of 1930s era or even beforehand. Okay, go back onto Green Street and go down. You had uh, some semi-modern facilities. There was a bookstore run by Evan Mall and Jerry Ray, if I remember rightly. Both it was a sort of second job for them, I think, and uh, then there was Bud Baker on the corner. He had married an Austin, and it was an Austin's uh, tennis store, tennis and bikes. So Bud would always repairing tennis, and he had a degree which related to sport, and he was well known, and actually ran for mayor later in his life. Uh, a local family, and across the road from Bud, there were apartments owned by, again, a local family, and I forget who, but right down the line a little bit was Steak and Shake, which is almost famous for farm era concerts and the like, where uh, Ebert Festival era, when people remembered Champaign-Urbana and Campus Town because of the Steak and Shake, which was sort of evolved here. Uh, Paralleling a little to the north of Green Street, there was a boneyard, and Boneyard Creek, and we've been talking about a Boneyard Creek. It's been modified for a big dig, and we've been talking about a big dig, and how it's been modified to make a big pond so that uh, excess runoff water would not flood Green Street. It was really pretty bad at one stage. You could row a boat down Green Street. So, but behind the fraternity I'm talking about was a Boneyard Creek, which had character. It had been channelized. It was straight, and water doesn't ever run straight. So you had little meanders here and there, and then it would duck under a street and be covered over. Uh, and so now, if you walk north a little bit, you can see it from across the Boneyard Creek. Was a annexed to the um, biology department. It was a natural history building and had two ponds outside. They were a little hard to maintain, but these ponds attracted fly-in ducks and other creatures. There were quail, and it was fenced so that you could also have some uh, prairie chickens. And amazingly, every once in a while, the male prairie chicken would come to the fence uh, and present his dance to the public, whereas you have to know the dance is designed for uh, inspiring females. it would happen, and this little tough little bundle of chicken would its hackles would rise on the tail, and the comb would get erect, and the wattles would get large, and it would say woo 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 woo, and do a dance, and then woo 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 again. So, just right on Campustown, there was this little place where it was reasonably fenced in steel, so that the people didn't get into the pond, and the pond was free for wildlife. And a lot of people would walk past it, but other people would go past it just to see it. And Dr. Kendi and others would be there as a head of natural history. And Dr. Kendi's case, he was uh, a bird specialist, Audubon sort of person. He created Audubon here, and uh, there were other people who were ichthyologists. There were fish, and there were experimental uh, offices there where you could study how insects, for instance, would relate to light, how they would relate to water, and so a lot of field work, but uh, also some lab work. Uh, so in that little alleyway that I'm talking about behind the fraternity was all the back entrances to the houses on or the shops on Green Street. And so there's a little buffering of back and forth with who parks who where, and walk in the back door of the store. There was a little post office there, which has now been moved to further down Green Street in a larger post office. Uh, there was a parking lot at one stage. This was a little later, but I got to know the person who was on the gate of the parking lot, and he had worked for. Uh, he had come to town on the train that brought orphans to town, the orphan train, and he had found his way. It wasn't easy for these were orphans that were picked up in New York and other places, and it was felt that they could find employment with people who wanted to have them as children, perhaps as workers. Sometimes it could be a little mean because they were used as workers. Sometimes it was very friendly because the people who took them on would want them to be uh, going to university or going to school. And he had an interesting career. He'd worked for an electronics company and worked around the world, but he had a heart attack, and so he couldn't move quite or stroke couldn't move quite as freely as he used to. But he had a second career. He was working with restaurant supply organizations, and his wife was doing that. So uh, we had to just exchange and know and talk to people, and that was a wonderful experience. We're talking about salvaging, and that was a situation where uh, uh, probably a 1920s building was utilized again as a restaurant. The restaurant was used as a fairly uh, friendly but official uh, place. The board of trustees used to meet there because they didn't have room in the union to do that, and the union wasn't expanded then. I forget when they left, when they left, I think the restaurant retired, but uh, Mrs. Smith ran the restaurant till it retired, and then she went round it as chalk and chalked out 17 apartments on the 3 floors. So they're all very individual apartments, and that resulted in an apartment building for a long time. And I had an apartment there, and by that time I'd met up with uh, Jan, my wife, and she was a geographer, and she came here independently. And at that stage, we were both fairly determined to meet other people rather than other Australians. But eventually, we had many overlapping interests, and we married and lived in a different apartment. But used that apartment with in the building until it was eventually sold to McDonald's and taken down. Uh, and I still have some pieces of the wood from that building. So that was recycling. Bullets got recycled, but you could walk down Green Street and there was history. The restaurant across the road, you could go there and you would meet up with the people who came as regulars, and that still goes on today. But it was a slightly different era. The Green Street has been remodeled for buses. There weren't so many buses. The motor industry didn't sort of happen until people went to World War II and started to use tanks and other equipment, and so uh, they came back from World War II and were prepared to use automobiles and roads rather than uh, trains and shipping. So uh, things changed, and things have changed quite dramatically. When I first came here, there was a a bus system, but it was very small compared with what it is now. And the streets have been modified to take buses. Uh, Now, what I can I tell you else? There was, if you walked up Wright Street, you came to administration buildings on the left. You had mathematicians first before the administration building, and one of those mathematicians was, I think his name was Fred Francis, and he delayed his uh, thesis for a master's degree until he finished it. And when it was finished, it was a 4-line degree. And he was employed by the Elgin Watch Company because he invented a system whereby springs that broke very rapidly and annoyingly in watches and clocks, and made a engineering formula that lasted for a long time and probably still is there in the elements. But Fred built a clock for the retiring class that he was in, and it's in the Union. It's not really up the top of the Union. It's been retired, and it's in storage at the moment because I asked, and Bruce Hannon, who is a clock specialist as well as a geographer and as an engineer, he knows where all these things are. The whole system was a little different. You had uh, uh, a basic warning for classes and things like that that were very well different. Uh, so that mathematician was there on Wright Street, and he retired. And I might talk about him later, but he retired to uh, northwest Illinois, where his family had a farm. It was adjacent to a cemetery, and he was a very different soul and a very interesting artist as well as a mathematician. He uh, built a little home for himself and for his wife, and it was Here's a Kuwani, and someday I'll talk about him. But these are the characters you find on the street and in the administration. And if you are prepared to talk a little, which I kind of am, you get to know them and you get to record uh, who's who and what's what. And some of these people are now passed on. Uh, One that I knew was Hadley Reid. At one stage, just passed. Helen Fry. She came here with her husband, who was a scientist, and he was uh, here for a few years and died. And so Helen, uh, Hadley, and I, and a few others would go talk and think about how we could reform the world. And Helen was there, and she met up with a guy named Ayres who had farmland at Monticello, but he had been uh, with Extension, and uh, and his children are in Monticello, and Jim has been mayor of Monticello, and he was near to Bement, and so Helen was uh, 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 joined a very different background, and she married Ayres, and she just passed the other day, and so I look at the obituaries often because you realize the relationships of a person to their children and to their associates, and uh, I find that to be rather informative. But I also go to funerals mainly to commiserate with the family, and often to meet with the family, which by that time is often dispersed. But sometimes I'm very quiet. I just go and listen and retreat. Sometimes I'm almost asked to give some commentary, which I try to do. Uh, So between the campus town and Champaign, there was a Burnham Hospital, and many people who are still alive today uh, were born there. And this was a city building. There was a lot of controversy about its demise. It was losing money. But many of the services we inspire or use are in that category. Uh, they are services. It's a little bit like the argument that we have about the post office these days, whether it should be efficient or whether it should be um, a service mainly. Certainly, uh, there's a camaraderie there. Uh, I can think at the moment if I have a package sent to me and it comes by post, I will receive it from a post person who knows the street and knows the people. And uh, whereas if that same package is sent by uh, other agencies, sometimes i- it's the area is not so well known, so you don't get that sort of service. Uh, I'm thinking of other things that went on around town. It was nice to be on Green Street in the era when you had flower children. I would tend the garden in the front of the southern tea rooms, and every once in a while someone would come to pick up a rose or a daffodil and walk down the street with it, and uh, almost as if it was the right thing to do in that era. And but okay, now I want to uh, change from that sort of era. I'm trying to think whether I should go to Urbana. Urbana had some of the same sort of situation, but a little to the east of Wright Street. The university was in the Urbana jurisdiction, but and so was Carl Clinic. But uh, and it had a square and it had the county seat, so it had a different sort of character. Uh, but it also had fires. There was quite a bit of firing because people were building frame buildings with wood, and that meant that dry wood in winter could be combustible. The era before I came was heavily with theaters because that was the way things were done. So we had theaters here and there that had been taken over by other agencies, and I'm interested to see that Dr. Youngerman is restoring an old theater and uh, just giving character to downtown. So you have to wonder, how do you preserve the dignity of an old town? Uh, do you tear down and create new? That is often what happens. Uh, and the new can be very friendly. It can have houses that are sorted out so that you can communicate with your neighbors. You can have all sorts of modern facilities, but somehow there's some character in these old buildings. And right on Market Street, right outside Weft, we're in that sort of debate. I talked to the manager of the Poor's uh, uh, Tap. Uh, it's a big old building. Hasn't been occupied for about 5 years, and then it was occupied as a bar. It's a very modern bar. You take a chip and you pull your beer and record what you've taken. If it's 8 ounces or 2 ounces or whatever, you just try for a sample. And so it's done reasonably well, especially well considering the virus. This year there's been no music, but that music did give character to this area. It was not only on Market Street, the closed Market Street, but other places in Champaign, and I'm sure that will come back if the virus uh, depletes. People are wearing masks and doing it fairly uh, carefully. So I think we fall in the category of obeying the scientists that say you need to stop this virus from moving around. It's a little awkward to be talking to each other. You can't see or recognize exactly who people are, but it's very, very helpful. So the question is, do we take the News Gazette building that's been bought and does that get to be removed? Well, yes. The uh, area that was where the offset press was a big offset press, and it was loaded with stuff like ink, and so that was taken down, and the offset press was salvaged. Uh, so there's a parking lot there at the moment, but right opposite Weft and us, there's a building that it needs a little airing out. It had a concrete add-on in front of it, which didn't really relate, and now it's been taken down. There's some nice uh, stained glass windows there, and it has character. So I think the city, uh, T.J. Blakeman especially, has been encouraging that building that's right opposite it not be torn down and given over to more modern facilities. Uh, the little like that concerns the bank across Taylor Street. It's how do we keep some of the character? At one stage, when Parkland was being built, many of the older buildings were taken down for parking, and the uh, the early Parkland College was in upstairs, downstairs, wherever uh, in the city buildings, because the city buildings were fairly empty, where much of the uh, effort had gone to, or much of the business had gone to malls, and even Neal Street was closed off with a mall. A street, it was a mall street, which was a little strange because when you came off of the highway to the north, 74 was very new. You came down Neal Street, you had to go east or west and go through town on Market Street. You don't have to do that anymore because it took $1 million to build uh, that mall experimentally, and it was a little cold and not awfully well used, and those sort of malls went out of fashion. So it was torn down, and the traffic comes through Neal Street anymore. And so you have to think, what will happen to the rest of the News Gazette building? Will it be uh, remodeled in traditional style, or will it be modernized? Will you have restaurants underneath? And if you go under the viaduct over the other side of, on the east side of Champagne, there's a set of old buildings that were occupied by doctors, and it's been various things for a long time, but it seems to me that the little street that comes out onto University Avenue is going to be closed off permanently, and the building has been taken up, gutted, and but the walls have been retained uh, in old style. So I walk by there fairly often just to get. I go over to the Big Dig and exercise and also see what's going on. But I've watched it, and it's getting into action. Uh, there's still the thought of a 250 million uh, ice hockey team and a building that's large enough for a stadium that would allow for venues. Venues are where you go out and invite uh, agencies that are interested to come and hold their annual meeting in your location, and therefore bring you business and uh, bring you art and other things too. So uh, we're still thinking about that. Grondalution, I think, is one of the main uh, people doing that. But the viruses come in between, and so cities don't have the same income that they used to have. Uh, the Inman Hotel would remain as a character. The MTD building would expand, and then we get involved to some extent because we're that sort of combination of art and science and education. And it looks like an antique store, and we don't really conform to gentrification. So we have to think about what we do and how we tidy ourselves up and how we could retain artists in downtown. There was a move afoot a while ago to raise money by taking the parking meters into 9 o'clock, and it does have made money enough to put up a parking building, uh, 3 or 4 stories, and there was lots of argument about that, whether we should rather have people walking around downtown rather than coming by a vehicle and needing a parking site or parking street. So at that time, many of the artists that were finding the old buildings are like ourselves. These 4 buildings were empty when uh, when everyone was escaping to the malls, and so uh, it got to be how do you retain the character of Champagne? A big building, a old building, an interesting building right on the corner of Main and Neil burned, and then there was a fire uh, where pennies used to be, just next to, and we had to think about what we would replace that with, and even today remember a Korean restaurant there that was rather popular that lost out to that fire. Uh, and so we work with people like Packer that think about old buildings and think about skirting boards that look old and are old and could give character to a building, to windows that need to be replaced because the sills are rotting out. How do you replace them? There's been a big argument about a Coke building down on South Neal Street because windows were put in that were aluminum and were different. And the Historic Preservation Division of the city, the advisory board, was not awfully pleased about that. So, uh, do you paint your brick or do you leave it to be itself? Do you sandblast the building? Uh, do you? How do you sandblast it? What sand do you use? Can you do it gently? Do you, if you sandblast it, do you take out the mortar that was hog's hair and lime and in a different era and softer? So if you sandblast too much, you can sandblast the heck out of the mortar between the bricks. Do you tuck point? We need to tuck point the front of our building. It will cost about $6,000. It's expensive, uh, but we also have to deal with windows, and so do others. And these buildings have been modified. There's a row of 8 on one side of facing a Market Street with a backing into a what was a alleyway, and then there's another set of 8 buildings facing Walnut, with backing onto an alleyway. And the alleyway was closed, and in many cases, it was filled in. Some cases, it hasn't been filled in. But sometimes there's a walkthrough from Market Street to Walnut Street, and so as you walk around, you're losing the music that attracted quite a lot of attention before the virus. But think about what you might want to do with your landscape. I was impressed this week. I opened the Journal Republican from Monticello, and the week before, there had been a picture of uh, a rail trail that we facilitated in the background, and there was a ceramic goose. So you see a trail that we bought. The railroad bed, Monticello and other municipalities were not really into buying railroad beds, but we managed to do so. But once we buy the railroad beds, then it gets to be that people want to do it. So that's exactly what we were intended to desire. We didn't have the money to do it ourselves. Monticello bought an easement from us and created a 1 mile trail that goes across the Sangamon River. Well, uh, so last week there was a picture of the trail and the goose. Uh, and this week there was a picture of a truss bridge. And the orientation was to the fact that the bottomlands was changing color and it was fall. And but I have to wonder how much it would cost to recreate a truss bridge. When we got bold, we got 3 truss bridges and 27 trestles, and we missed one bridge because we weren't quite fast enough. But it's facilitating people enjoying this trail, and that's why the journalist was there checking out the goose, but also checking out the bridge, which is a rather wonderful resource. And we have other bridges that towards Clinton that are helpful in this domain. One is at Shady Rest, and one is uh, at uh, Saltfall Creek, and they're subject to a loss of ties. We bought railroad bridge ties to fill in the gaps, and sometimes people who were clever enough with bobcats and the like to salvage the ties we put down because they weren't held down by steel. So it hasn't always been easy, but we haven't done the 23 miles from Whiteheath to Clinton yet, but we're thinking and we're hoping that the success of the Kickapoo Trail to the east, which we initiated, and the Monticello Bridge Trail, which is being well used, as is the Kickapoo Trail, and along with the prairie that's on the side of each uh, uh, ballast, then we almost game to start thinking about activating a rail trail, which will call for a lot of money support and volunteer support, and it might take 20 years to put in, but we're at it. And we're also at bringing recreational historic trains in from Monticello to Champaign, and that will involve not only re-railing our own 4 miles that we own, uh, but 7 miles of active line with rail on it. We're hoping to retain that rail. So I'm watching the clock, and I like to give WEFT time to express itself at the end of my talk. So I will say, this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champagne, and uh, look at things, look at things in a larger sense as you walk around, and look at the little things and see what you can do.